delay. The meeting has been suspended until live streaming has been established, which it now is, and therefore we're able to start this meeting of the Standards Committee. Can I welcome all those viewing online and members and officers who are present. First item on the agenda is a declaration of interest. Are there any declarations?
I have one to declare, Chairman, which I'll declare on the fifth item.
Thank you, Councillor Boyack. Nothing further?
Excuse me, Chair. Could I seek advice on item 5C? I sit on the Pensions Committee, and that item is related to that. I don't know if John could advise if there's any conflict there.
Yes, Chair, I also sit on that same committee.
And me too.
Thank you, councillors. The item at 5C is a request for a dispensation for Councillor Walsh, who has been appointed the Director of Border to Coast, which deals with significant investments on behalf of a number of different pension funds. In view of the nature of that request, I don't believe that there's a conflict that would apply to Councillors Hetherington, this or Thompson.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so apologies for absence, Brian.
Yes, we have received apologies from Anne Dark.
Thank you very much. I spoke to Anne Dark yesterday because she's having difficulty getting through on Zoom and having problems getting through with the telephone. It's something which I think Brian is looking into for future meetings.
Correct, Chair.
Thank you. So moving on, the minutes of the meeting of the 6th of July, which was also online.
Move them, Chairman.
Seconded, Chairman.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Chair, if I could raise one matter just relating to item 6 in the minutes. It's really just for clarification. The very last paragraph of item 6 says the committee was advised, should the monitoring officer decide that a complaint against an elected member required formal investigation, an independent person was appointed to carry this out. Just to be absolutely correct, the process is that an investigator, who can be internal or external, will be appointed, as well as an independent person who will act as a sounding board for the subject member.
Thank you.
That clarification just
Could that be entered into the formal records, Brian, please?
Yes, Chair, I'll make sure that's done.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. There were a couple of other items which, as we all know, council officers have been somewhat overburdened with COVID-related activities and the inconvenience of COVID, etc. So I'm not really asking if anything's been done about this, but just to keep it in the record. Item 4 was a request that the minutes of our meetings go to the council. And the second point was that the officers were following up on the reasons why those who engage a corporate complaint at some level cease to carry that forward, but there's no indication that they've been satisfied with the outcome. So again, that's something totally understandable. It's not the most pressing need at present, but I would like it to remain as an outstanding item. Okay.
Great.
Anything further? Okay, so moving on to item 4 in today's agenda. Complaints against elected members under the Members' Code of Conduct, an updated report. John, are you speaking to this?
I am, thank you, Chair. This is a report from the monitoring officer, who I think as the chairman has indicated, is engaged with COVID-related duties this morning. At the last meeting of Standards Committee, I presented a report outlining some of the nature and number of the complaints that had been received under the Members' Code of Conduct. This report is an update to that. The report is fairly concise. There's a couple of things I would particularly draw members' attention to. In paragraph 3, there's been some analysis of the data that we have collected. The general trend over the past few months is that complaints under the Code of Conduct are increasing. We don't yet see those slowing down, so it may be that they continue to rise. About 50% of complaints relating to elected members are submitted by elected members, and almost all of the rest are complaints submitted by members of the public. The proportion of complaints that are now proceeding to formal investigation is just over a fifth, and a similar proportion of complaints have either been informally resolved or they have been closed because the complainant has not provided sufficient evidence to justify taking it forward. The report sets out the Code of Conduct and the various requirements on members. There are 11 separate parts to that, and in order to be able to identify trends, the monitoring officer, along with her 2 deputies and the chairman of the committee, have devised a labelling system essentially in order to categorise the complaints. Briefly, level 0 complaints relate to concerns that are raised with the monitoring officer, but in support of which there's no evidence provided. Level 1 complaints are those which actually amount to a complaint. They can be considered. Level 2 are complaints where the evidence has been considered. Attempts at informal resolution are either considered inappropriate or have failed, and a formal investigation is underway. And level 3 complaints are where a formal investigation has resulted in matters being referred to the committee for a formal hearing. As things stand at the moment, members will see from the list of 50 complaints, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 complaints that have reached level 2, and they are in the process of being investigated as we speak. The speed by which these can be investigated is unfortunately dictated by the demands on officers relating to COVID, and it does look as if those COVID demands are on the increase as things stand. Unless members have any questions about the report, that's a summary of what it says.
Thank you, John. Any questions?
Yes, Chair, just on that labelling section, I was wondering if the committee may consider if we received regular reports so we could follow any trends on that, fortnightly or monthly, just so we were aware of any increases or if it leveled off.
Well, that's a useful suggestion. I mean, it is a live record, so it's being updated daily. I have no problem. John, in terms of the practicalities of doing this?
Well, the committee will receive a report similar to this every quarter in relation to the scheduled meetings. It may be that a monthly report can be provided. I'm not quite sure just what information it will show, given that it's constantly changing, but certainly that should be something that can be circulated to committee members.
Yeah, thanks, John. I just think it would just give an indication of how they were being addressed, and we would be aware of any trends. Yeah.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Chair?
sorry, Councillor Boyer. Councillor Hetherington was asked. Okay.
Mhm. Okay, right, thanks, Chair. Could I first of all say that I did submit a series of questions, which I copied to yourself and Nicola, and I included Jill and John in that. And I would just like to thank Nicola for the quick response that she gave to, and very comprehensive response to my questions. I think there was just a couple of things really, and I appreciate why now the explanation is that there isn't a time limit on investigating complaints, which there is under the council's normal complaints procedure, because I did notice that one in particular was dating back to July 2019, which seemed to be quite a long time. And I also asked about whether, there were a number of complaints about the same elected member and whether we were receiving them from the same complainant, which there are significant numbers involved in that. I think the only thing that I would like to say to add to this report, to bring a bit more context into it, is when the complaints are being closed, if a closure reason could be added onto that table, just to give us an idea of how that, in line with what Councillor Thompson's saying, to give us an idea of how that complaint was actually dealt with, because otherwise we aren't getting that information if it's not actually coming to Standards Committee for investigation. And I appreciate that, a lot of them may be that there isn't sufficient information to enable the complaint to proceed, but I do think it would be helpful, rather than just saying case informally resolved and or closed. It really doesn't tell us anything about what's happened with that particular complaint. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hetherington. Yes, I understand the point you're making. I should say that having seen some complaints out of the 178 that John mentioned in his report in July, some of them are extremely difficult to decipher what it is, whether it's actually a complaint about the code of conduct or even whether it's a complaint. Sometimes I think some people take to making what they would call a complaint, but really they just want to vent their feelings in a particular way. That said, I think the fact that we're trying to codify these into different levels, I think the suggestion that we indicate whether they were closed because there was no evidence or the evidence wasn't provided or an informal resolution was made, I think it would be useful if we can do that. John, I don't think that would be a problem for our records at all.
No, I think it may be difficult to record the reason with any particular detail, but certainly in terms of recording whether a complaint's been closed because no evidence was provided, because an informal resolution had been able to be achieved, or because of a monitoring officer's decision, that would be fine. Of the others, the committee are likely to know about those complaints anyway, because they will progress to the committee.
Yes.
Chair, could
Yes.
I just come in on that? I know that Annex B of the protocol on dealing with complaints against elected members does give some indication about why complaints might not be investigated further. So maybe it's that section, it's on page 236. So maybe that could be used as a basis with which to determine, why a complaint hasn't proceeded any further.
Yes, in fact, I think I'm right in saying that my report contains a list of the criteria which the monitoring officer applies. So I think it may be that we could use that, but could we leave it to the officers to determine the most appropriate means of doing so?
Yes, I'm happy to do that, Chair. I just think it is in the public interest and also for information for the committee that it is included. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mr.
Just
Chair,
for the record, can I just make clear that the complainant and the complainee are their names, and the complaint is kept confidential until it was to be progressed to a level that brings a report to this committee, at which time any report that comes to this committee by an investigator becomes a matter of public record and is in the public domain.
Mhm.
John, sorry, you wanted to speak?
Sorry, Chair. Just picking up on Councillor Hetherington's point, in circumstances where the reason for a complaint not proceeding is a monitoring officer's decision, then I don't see any difficulty in recording after that one or more of the reasons in Annex B upon which that decision was based. I think that doesn't get into the detail that I would be concerned about. So I think that's
Thank you very
perfectly
much.
possible.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, John, for that.
Anything further on item 4? Okay, can we move on then to item 5, which is applications for dispensation?
Chairman, this report, the application for dispensation under the Code of Conduct, Councillor Dixon's mentioned in the report, and with her being my daughter, I need to declare an interest.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I believe that the protocol is that you will be muted and video stream switched off for the duration of the discussion.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, Chair, I'll arrange that and then I'll resubmit Councillor Boyack when that item's finished.
Thank you very much, Brian. Okay, so first of all, may I say that to apologise to you all for the late arrival of papers on item 5. This is a matter which has taken considerable amount of monitoring officer and legal opinion time, and I was asked earlier in the week that there might be, at least I was informed that there might be a delay, and I took the view that provided we got the papers by Friday, that would give us sufficient time over Saturday and Sunday to read them. But this was a complicated matter which involved third-party discussions with legal counsel. So taking time on this was unfortunately inevitable. Okay, so John, can I ask you on behalf of the monitoring officer to speak to this paper, please?
Yes, Chair, thank you. I'll deal with item 5A in first, deal with them in alphabetical order, which seems sensible. Item 5A relates to an application for dispensations under the Members' Code of Conduct on behalf of Councillor Ian Malcolm, who is a non-executive director of Newcastle International Airport Limited, and on behalf of Councillor Ian Malcolm and Tracy Dixon, who are directors, who are respectively a director and an alternate director of the Newcastle Airport Holding Company Limited. The report sets out the requirements of members under the Localism Act 2011 on members to not only register personal interests, but also disclosable pecuniary interests, and also to make declarations of interest in certain meetings. The roles that Councillor Malcolm and Councillor Dixon have in the in Newcastle International Airport and in the holding company are not remunerated, so they are not disclosable pecuniary interests. However, they are significant interests which they will which would, unless a dispensation is granted, prevent them from taking part to the fullest extent in certain meetings that relate to the airport.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you, John? There's a telephone ringing of some sort.
It was mine.
Could you mute your microphone, please, while John's speaking? Thank
Sorry.
you. Okay, John.
Thank you. In paragraph 20 of the report, the monitoring officer has set out the matters that Standards Committee need to consider when deciding whether the dispensations requested should be granted. Of the 5 grounds that Standards Committee need to consider, 3 of them aren't relevant for the reasons set out, primarily because the lack of remuneration for the roles means that the members concerned do not have disclosable pecuniary interests, only personal interests. Grounds C and E are matters that Standards Committee will need to consider when making their decision. Ground C is that the committee needs to ask itself whether the authority, that's the council, considers the dispensation is in the interests of residents. The monitoring officer has commented there. She says that this ground requires a value judgment to be made by the committee. The ground is relevant in the context of elected members having specialist knowledge and experience of not only the airport, but the holding company and airport matters, which can be of benefit to and contribute to debates and consideration of the airport that take place within the council. Council is, of course, a shareholder in both of those companies. Ground E is that the authority considers it's otherwise appropriate to grant the dispensation. And again, the monitoring officer's comments remind the committee it's a value judgment for them to make. This ground is relevant in the context of elected members having knowledge and experience of the airport and the holding company and airport matters. Save where any recommendation about remuneration of directors or payment of expenses is concerned, it could be considered reasonable to consider that elected members have important contributions to make to the council's understanding of the operation and the performance of the airport and the operation and oversight of its holding company. And Standards Committee should also consider whether public confidence is likely or unlikely to be damaged by the participation of those elected members at council meetings. It's possible that the committee may consider that it's in the interests of residents and otherwise appropriate that the dispensation be granted so that the experience gained by those elected members from their involvement in the airport can be drawn upon by the council when it conducts its own proceedings. The recommendations section of the report, it's at paragraph 33, sets out that if the committee is minded to grant the dispensation, it sets out the proposed wording of that dispensation and the term for which that dispensation would be active. That's the report in its general terms. If any members have questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Thank you very much. Over to you, colleagues.
Yes, Chair, I'd like to speak.
Yes, Councillor Thompson.
Thank you. I realise there was an awful lot of work put into this report, and it's very well laid out. But I have to say, the report on this application was only received by committee members on Friday. Without doubt, there's been insufficient time to give this the attention that it warrants. Of course, in normal circumstances, the granting of dispensation would almost be a formality for this committee. But in these circumstances, which are detailed in the background paragraphs of this application, it implies that Councillors Ian Malcolm and Tracy Dixon have been consistently in breach of the Code of Conduct and acting unlawfully under Section 34 of the Localism Act. Is it not the clear responsibility of this Standards Committee to adjourn this application and pass the details to the police for the Crown Prosecution Service's consideration? If in fact this has not already been done, only after this process has taken place can this committee be expected to consider the application in question. There is clear precedent for legal action in these circumstances under the Localism Act, and it would be improper and lacking due diligence for this committee under these circumstances at this time to grant dispensation. I ask the committee to adjourn item 5A and refer this to the relevant authorities.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. You mentioned a legal opinion, so can I first of all ask John Rumley, please, the head of legal services, to comment on the specific point about a legal implication.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as Councillor Thompson refers to, there is provision in the Localism Act for failure to declare interests to be considered to be a criminal offence. Now that is far from certain in these circumstances, and it's really only something that the Director of Public Prosecutions can determine. The request for a dispensation is entirely forward-looking. It doesn't affect what has gone on in the past at all. So it doesn't prevent concerns being raised about previous conduct. And in fact, there are a number of complaints that were included in the data contained in the previous report under the Members' Code of Conduct, which do relate to this particular issue. The granting of a dispensation in the future would not prevent any matters that have taken place in the past being addressed and raised. And so for that reason, there's no compelling need for matters in the future to be put on hold whilst matters in the past are dealt with. I trust that answers your question, Councillor Thompson.
I understand what you're saying, John, thank you. But I'd like to come back on that. I mean, we are the Standards Committee. Your detailed report here clearly implies unlawful activity. For this Standards Committee now to grant this dispensation will be seen by the public as us condoning this unlawful activity. And on that basis, I'd like to ask for the repeatedly ask for that adjournment. I cannot see that even if you take the position this is future, not retrospective, I don't think the Standards Committee would be serving the public well in not appreciating the information that is in front of us today. I have a very strong position that this should be adjourned, and it should go through that process, as you mentioned, the CPS make a decision before it comes back here for us to be in a position to make a decision on this.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. I've got Councillor Hobson's hands up, Councillor Smith and Councillor Purvis. I think in that order, Councillor Hobson.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, you know, we aren't looking at retrospective permission here. We are looking at a forward-looking dispensation, and for those reasons, I would move the recommendation. You know, whatever happens in the past is up to members to look at. But I think we're looking at future dispensations, and that's what we're looking at here, nothing else. And I would move the recommendation on those grounds. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hobson. Councillor Smith.
Yes, Chair, I would second the recommendation to move this dispensation. We're not talking about the past, and it is very important that regionally we have a say in what is happening with the airport. So I would second this recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Purvis. You're muted. You need to switch your mute off.
Thank you. Thank you. I would support the recommendation and oppose the adjournment, but I would like to ask something. I wonder why this has suddenly arisen, because as far as I'm aware, things like Councillor Dixon and Councillor Malcolm's association with the airport are in the public domain and have been the subject of comments, you know, in past years. So I'm just wondering why we're suddenly being asked to consider this matter now. How has it arisen?
Thank you. John, can you answer that? Are you able to answer that?
I believe I am. certainly it's not the involvement of Councillors Malcolm and Councillor Dixon in the airport and the holding company is not something that's been concealed. And I think it's also something that they have included on the members' register of interests. But that is not the same as making a declaration in meetings. And that is why the dispensation is needed. In terms of why it's arisen now, it's my understanding that when Nicola Roberson was appointed to the role of monitoring officer in September, there have been a number of things that have come to light, such as this, which she, along with myself and my colleague, my other deputy monitoring officer, Jill Hayden, have been asked to look at. It's fair to say that this is quite a complex area of law, and in relation to this, as well as dealing with the matters arising out of COVID, we did take the advice of leading counsel on this in terms of how to ensure that members complied going forward, as well as seeking advice about how best to discharge the monitoring officer's duties in relation to matters that have gone on in the past. So it's not something that's arisen in the last couple of weeks. It's something that has been worked on for a number of months, but I think I can say with some confidence it was not something that was a live issue until after Nicola was appointed to the post of monitoring officer, and until after she then took steps to make sure that she was discharging her statutory duties as a monitoring officer completely properly.
Can I just amplify what John said earlier, that we have already received a number of code of conduct complaints alleging breaches of the code, and they are investigations of those. Sorry, I shouldn't use the word investigation, that has a particular meaning. Those alleged complaints, those complaints of alleged breaches are in progress of being addressed. Our decision today is about the future, and that does not, and I took advice on this myself as well, that does not imply any consideration of the past.
Excuse Chair, could I just reply to that? Yeah, I can see everybody's taking a position on this as a future dispensation, but there's no doubt about it that there will be a perception that this standards committee will be seen as condoning what is set out very clearly in front of us in this report as unlawful behaviour. We will be seen as condoning this. You can say as much as you want that this is a future position, but it is connected. It is connected to individual people. If it wasn't about individual people, the names wouldn't be in there. If it was just for dispensation, you wouldn't have the detail of the particular councillors. And those particular councillors, it is well presented in this report, a clear implication of unlawful behaviour. And for us, I'll repeat it again, for us to condone that will be seen very poorly by the public.
Well, I would discourage people from saying that to the public, because it's not the case. We are being asked to consider the future, and we have got people who are named. There may be already complaints, at which point this standards committee would in public address a report on the investigation into those complaints. It's not a matter that we are ignoring the past from the point of view of condoning it. We're ignoring it because the decision we're being asked to make is from today, the 14th of September. Are we willing to grant dispensations along the lines mentioned on page 23 of your report? We've had a motion moved to accept that. We've had it seconded. However, Councillor Thompson had first moved that the committee be adjourned I'm not quite sure until when, but perhaps you'd clarify that, Councillor Thompson.
Yeah, I'll repeat that. I'd like to call for an adjournment based on the fact that this report implies unlawful behaviour, and the process of this being referred to the authorities for the CPS to consider, for that process to take place before we come back and consider this application.
Councillor Hetherington, you had raised your hand during that
Yeah.
point.
Just a comment and a question, Chair, going forward on this. I think a number of us have positions on other bodies. You know, myself, Councillor Thompson and Councillor Purvis, for example, are on the Pensions Committee. And so I have just recently been appointed to Housing Ventures Trust Board, and I have asked about a dispensation for myself for that under the Localism Act, which I'm waiting for a response on, because I assume I'll need to have that. Not that I've taken part in any meetings where this has been discussed just yet. But what I would like to ask John is that, do we all then need to have something like this relating to whichever external bodies we are involved with? Because taking Councillor Thompson's point, if we've had involvement with these bodies in the past, the same thing will apply to us. And, you know, so, and then my other question is, by not taking a forward-facing view on these applications, are we then, as a standards committee, not complicit in this, you know, breaking of the law? If we don't then take some action going forward? Yes, you know, when we're not saying that, as John's just clarified, that these things are being investigated retrospectively, but going forward as a committee, now that we're aware that there is a need for this dispensation, you know, what is our position in being complicit in illegal action if we don't take some action now to you know, correct that legal position?
John?
Yes.
I think our question was addressed to you as
Yes.
the Deputy Monitoring Officer.
Any decision made by the committee today has no impact on what has gone on in the past. This is the committee's being asked to determine a request for a dispensation from Councillors Malcolm and Councillor Dixon. A decision to grant that dispensation does not in any way condone what has gone on in the past. I take the point that Councillor Thompson has made about the impression that that could give a member of the public. But certainly in relation to other positions that members have in relation to outside bodies, then I understand that an email has been sent to all members asking them to think carefully about what are the roles they have, and if members are in any doubt about whether they're dual or triple roles that they may have in relation to other bodies may require a dispensation, then that is certainly something that they should ask us specifically about. It may not be necessary, but certainly I think it's something that members in the past haven't been asked to look at in any detail, and clearly it's something that members need to satisfy themselves about going forward.
Okay, thank you, John. Councillor Hobson.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a comment, because as someone who's been on the council for many years, you know, the airport was represented traditionally and historically by the leader and deputy leader of the council. And going back, I've served under 4 leaders of councils, and you know, all of those leaders were the representatives on the airport committee. So this is not something new. And you know, although we're naming names here, I mean, until recently, Councillor Dixon was not the second person on the airport committee. You know, so you know, how far we're going to go back here looking at who was the representatives and not declaring this. I know in meetings I have heard it declared. As I say, I've been on the council for many years, so we're getting into very, very muddy
Okay.
waters.
Well, I
here.
think we're in danger of straying into a discussion that we might have should a complaint reach us formally as a report of an investigation of the past. But I remind you, colleagues, we're talking about the future. However, can I ask you, please, we've had a motion to adjourn. I think the motion was conditional on there being some investigation by or reporting to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Can I be allowed, Councillor Thompson, to put the motion as simply that we're being asked to adjourn this item for now?
Could I just say quickly a couple more before you do that?
Go on.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I think it's very clear, John touched on this, this is a very complex situation. And we have new information in front of us today. And I think it's clear that to be able to vote on this with any confidence, this should go through due process.
Okay, thanks. Okay, can I put this to you then, please? I'm not taking any more points at this stage. I want to hear what your feelings are regarding the proposal that we adjourn today's meeting. Those in favour, please indicate.
Yes, I propose that.
Is it seconded? No. So I'm sorry, I think that motion fails. Councillor Hetherington, you were wanting to be heard.
Yeah, yes, if you don't mind, Chair, it was just simply John didn't address my question about if we don't do this today, are we then complicit in wrongdoing going forward, taking what Councillor Thompson has just said about, you know, investigating the past? Because as we are now aware of that situation, should we not be making some decision on, you know, protecting all elected members, not just simply the two that we're talking about, but all elected members from wrongdoing? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Hetherington. I think the answer to your question is this. If a decision isn't made today in respect of these requests for dispensations, then that would mean that the two councillors concerned would not be able to take part in meetings relating to the airport. Now,
Council
the reason for the request is to enable that to continue for the reasons set out in the report, given the experience and knowledge that they have of the workings of the airport, which can and arguably should play a part in decisions made by the council that relate to transport matters. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Thank you. So we've had a proposal from Councillor Hobson, seconded by Councillor Smith, that we accept these recommendations as set out on page 23 of today's agenda minute papers, that for a period of 2 years, with some caveats. Councillor Malcolm and Councillor Dixon are granted dispensations. Agreed?
Agreed.
Not agreed.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Thank you all. Can we move on then, please, to item 5B on the agenda, and ask John if he would present this paper. Maybe, if you'll permit him to present it truncated, because I think I'm right in saying that many of the supporting paragraphs in this section are a duplicate of what we've had in paragraph in section 5A.
Yes, Chair. There are 4 requests for dispensations relating to roles that members have on the board of South Tyneside Homes. Councillors Peacock and Foreman are board members who are not remunerated for that particular role, and therefore their situation in terms of having personal interests is the same as the one that the committee has discussed previously relating to councillors Malcolm and Dixon. They requested dispensation for in the terms set out at the end of the report, and the issues that relate to that request are the same as the ones that the committee has just discussed. The situation is slightly different in relation to Councillor Edward Malcolm and Councillor Sewell, in that they both receive a remuneration as part of their role as chair and vice chair of the board. That's set out in paragraphs 11 and 12. The fact that they receive remuneration means that they have a disclosable pecuniary interest rather than a personal interest. And that is a distinction upon which legal advice has been taken, and the legal implications and the advice received are set out in paragraphs 29 to 32 of the report. Unless members have any particular questions about that, that is what is being put to the committee, to grant a dispensation to those 4 members for the reasons set out.
Could I just ask, before we come into the comment, on page 31, paragraph 31, the final sentence, I wonder, John, could you just clarify what the implication of that is? Leading counsel have advised that in the circumstances as they have developed, the monitoring officer is not bound to make a report under the law of the council members' code of conduct. Could you just clarify that, please?
Yes, I can, Chair. When these matters came to light, as I mentioned previously, the monitoring officer was very keen to make sure that she was discharging her statutory duties to the fullest extent and entirely properly. The fact that criminal offences can be committed in certain circumstances if involvement in meetings by members takes place without a dispensation having been granted was something upon which a leading QC specialising in governance matters such as this was obtained. Now, the offence in question is a qualified offence. And what I mean by that is that it amounts to an offence if a member takes part in a meeting without reasonable excuse. And the circumstances in which these matters arose were complex, and it's, as it's mentioned in paragraph 31, the Constitution itself could be a lot clearer in relation to what is required, particularly when it deals with the definition of what a personal interest is and what a disclosable pecuniary interest is. So taking into account all of those matters and the fact that the monitoring officer has contacted all members about their obligations, raised this as a significant issue, and the contents and the clarity or lack of in the Constitution, leading counsel advised that it was not necessary for the monitoring officer to make a report. The law doesn't require that to take place mechanically. There is a number of considerations that need to be made, and on that basis he gave his advice as set out in paragraph 31.
Could I comment on that, Chair?
Yes.
It's a personal responsibility, if I understand that right, John. And we're talking about seasoned, experienced councillors in this case. And as you say, there's legal precedent for this. And unless you've got a reasonable excuse in law, it is unlawful. And this is double barrel. This is pecuniary and interest, declaration of interest, which is an even more unlawful position as to the previous item. I'd just like to make that clear and ask one question on the councillors involved here. I know the report contains information about remunerations for Councillor Malcolm and Sewell, but for Foreman and Peacock, can I ask, whilst they don't receive a remuneration, they will receive special responsibility allowances for this? Is that correct?
I'm afraid I don't know that, councillor.
Right.
Anybody have any answer to Councillor Thompson's question? No, that's a question that's going to need to be. Councillor Hetherington, you're muted.
Sorry, Chair. Yes, Chair. Sorry, I wasn't meaning to come in on Councillor Thompson's question.
Okay, well, can we just leave it until we've dealt with that?
I just wanted to ask.
Councillor Thompson has asked a specific question which none of us has an answer for. Brian, could you note that, please, and can we subsequently find an answer to that question?
Yes, I think Jill may have something to add as well, Chair.
Jill? Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, can I just confirm that there's no special responsibility allowance for being a member of South Tyneside Homes, not in the members' allowance document?
Thank you very much. Does that answer your question, Councillor
Yes.
Thompson? Thank you.
Yeah,
Councillor
thank you.
Hetherington, you were making another point.
Yes, just a question, Chair. We're being asked to give a dispensation for all 4 elected members, and my question is, because there are different interests being declared, disclosable pecuniary and just personal interest, is it appropriate that all 4 are included under the same global dispensation, or should it be separate?
Well,
Yes, councillor, the dispensation as worded would cover all 4. The difference in nature of the interests that each pair of councillors have doesn't require a separate dispensation. The dispensation as proposed would cover all 4.
Right, thank you. It was just a clarification.
I'll just remind you what the dispensation is doing. It's giving, if you like, permission from today for the named individuals to be allowed to speak and vote, which is more than a member of a public could have done had they been attending a council meeting. We're not being asked to consider their membership of a board of some other organisation or whatever, only the dispensation to allow them to speak and to vote at appropriate council meetings. Councillor Thompson?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'd just like to repeat, this is has a lot in relation to the last item. So again, yes, of course, in normal circumstances, the granting of compensation, of dispensation would almost be a formality here by this committee. But in these circumstances, again, which are detailed in the background paragraphs of this application, it implies that councillors Edward Malcolm, James Sewell, James Foreman and Margaret Peacock have been consistently in breach of the Code of Conduct and acting unlawfully under Section 34 of the Localism Act 2011 for several years. These are seasoned, experienced councillors. Is it not the clear responsibility of this Standards Committee to adjourn this application and pass the details to the police for the Crown Prosecution Service's consideration, if in fact this has not already been done? Only after this process has taken place can this committee be expected to consider the application in question. Again, there is clear precedent for legal action in these circumstances and under the Localism Act. And it would be improper and lacking due diligence for this committee under these circumstances at this time to grant dispensation. I ask the committee to adjourn item 5B and refer this to the relevant authorities.
Okay, I hear that motion. I've got hands up. Councillor Smith, I think, was first.
Yes, Chair, I would like to move that we agree this dispensation. I mean, we've got to have South Tyneside Homes running properly, and we need to have the councillors on that committee. So I would move it.
Yes, we're not, bear in mind what I just said earlier. This is not about whether or not these councillors are members of their various boards. It's a matter of if they can speak at council meetings, that's to say South Tyneside council meetings, and vote at those meetings. Without a dispensation, they could not lawfully do that from today. I repeat to Councillor Thompson what we said earlier. You're suggesting that we adjourn until an investigation is taking place, I think, if it was to summarise it, and a report to the police. We're not talking about a complaint at the moment about what has happened in the past. Should we receive, or if we progress, complaints against alleged breach of code of conduct, then they would come to this committee and all those points that you raised would be considered. But for the time being, we're being asked from today to permit the named individuals to speak at council meetings and to vote if on matters that they are privy to because of their involvement with these third-party organisations. So we're not making any reference to the past.
Thanks, Chair. And I'd just like to say again that we have an issue in this borough with transparency and trust with the public. And I'll repeat again, this will be condoned as us accepting unlawful behaviour. There's no two ways about that. That is how it's going to be perceived. And I agree with that perception. And that's why it needs to go through due process before we make a decision on this. We received the papers on Friday. It's very complex. There's a lot of issues. And I think if some of the councillors on this committee today are going to vote this through, I think they need to justify it.
Councillor Hobson.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, as chair of a transport committee, for which I do receive remuneration, if an item comes up on the agenda of the council meeting and that we're asked to declare an interest, I declare an interest at that time. And, you know, we do not know whether these people have been declaring their interest at council meetings. And it's not always that an item on housing does come up at a council meeting.
Forgive me,
so, you know.
Yeah, forgive me, Councillor Hobson, but again, you're talking about the past. We're not being asked about the past. We're being asked about this particular recommendation. The recommendation is that the dispensations are granted for the named individuals until May 2021.
Excuse, Chair, I did ask for an adjournment.
Yes, I know. I'm just come to that.
Sorry.
Before we vote on that, we need to ask Councillor Thompson's put forward a motion to adjourn the meeting. Is there a seconder for that proposal? No, so the proposal fails. Can I therefore ask you all, are you in favour of accepting the recommendation appearing on page 33 concerning the named individuals, that the dispensation be granted until May 2021?
Agreed.
Agreed. Not agreed.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you. Can we move on? Item 5C and page 35 of your papers. John, could you speak to this, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Item 5C relates to a request for a dispensation from Councillor Anne Walsh. She has only recently been appointed as a director, a non-executive director of Border to Coast Pensions Partnership Limited. So this report doesn't require the committee to give any consideration to what has gone on in the past because there is no past to this. In relation to the dispensation, Councillor Walsh has been appointed, as I say, to the board of Border to Coast Pensions Partnership. That company is owned by 11 local government pension funds and is established to provide collective investment across those funds. It deals with huge amounts of money, and Councillor Walsh has been appointed on the basis of her involvement in the Tyne and Wear Pension Fund. The duties that she would have as a non-executive director are set out in paragraph 4.6 of the report. Councillor Walsh will receive a shareholder director remuneration of £15,000 per annum, and you'll see from the report that it's expected that she will need to dedicate 3 days a month in order to perform her role. The matters that Standards Committee needs to consider when dealing with this request are set out in paragraph 4.11, and the terms of the dispensation are set out at the end of the report. It is to last for 2 years and provides the usual restriction that Councillor Walsh should not participate in any discussion or vote where changes to remuneration are discussed. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. Any questions of John? Any comments? Can I ask, are you agreed to the proposal that Councillor Walsh receives a dispensation for the 2 years as specified on page 41 of your papers?
Agreed. Agreed.
That's unanimous. Thank you very much. So, moving on, item 6 is my report on. It was meant to have been an annual report, but this is 2 years since since I've been chair. But my intention is that it be an annual report in future on the work of the Standards Committee over the period, and it's in 3 parts. But before I go any further, can I just stress this is my report. So it's me as Graham Wright, the independent chair of the Standards Committee. I've had enormous help in the provision of information from officers of the council, but errors and omissions, as they say, are entirely my responsibility. I don't think I get any fees for the publication of this mammoth item, but I would draw your attention to some things, if I may. It's in 3 parts. The first part should, most of it, if not all of it, should be familiar to you, because in a sense, it's a summary of what we've been doing at meetings and a summary of statistics. There are some charts and figures which are a bit out of date, and indeed later on in today's meeting we'll see some updates of those charts and figures. But I wanted, as a matter of record, to show what we've been doing, and more particularly to identify the way in which our activities have been raising standards in South Tyneside. So it's put together, as I said, in the first instance. The first section, A, is about corporate complaints, and as you know, the Standards Committee does not deal with individual complainants to the council about corporate activities, but it is charged with ensuring that there is a system of complaints that works effectively, and the figures are in there. So it's listed what we've done in terms of developing new ways to present the data, often graphically, to indicate trends. We've talked about the ways in which councillors' induction process goes, and we've identified a number of areas for enhancement, and officers have been and are continuing to work on updating plans for the induction of new councillors in May 2021. I've had in that process individual face-to-face meetings with each of the new councillors, that's to say new as they were in 2019. Is that right, Glenn?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And we've also participated, at least I've also participated in some standards-related activities. We collectively have looked at the local government associations documentation and on the proposals from the Committee for Ethical Standards in Public Life, which made a number of very helpful suggestions, but which sadly seem to have fallen by the wayside due to a combination of Brexit and COVID. Nevertheless, we move on to other matters, and that is the Code of Conduct complaints. That's to say, complaints or allegations of breaches of the code in the Code of Conduct. Again, data on here was being received at different times, and so those of you who have a numerate bent who like to add up figures to see whether they add up the same on page 4 as they did on page 5 will no doubt find some errors. However, the point is not to have numerical accuracy, but rather to show the trends. And as we've already discussed in John's report earlier, that trend is sadly that there's an increase in the number of complaints about councillors, some of which are quite serious. And a large amount of work has now fallen on the shoulders of the monitoring office. And that's something which, as employers, the council may need to keep an eye on. Again, in terms of raising standards, the interesting thing about the Code of Conduct complaints is that although they've been increasing and they're voluminous, up till the 20th of August, which is when I finalised this report, no complaint had reached us as a standards committee, that we hadn't had any complaint that had gone through the system, so to speak, leading to an investigation and subsequent report for consideration by this committee. There are sadly some investigations underway, and reports may well be coming to us in the future. But in the period up till the 20th of August, we had no such reports. Finally, the section on my observations. I have to say, I think we've done an enormous amount of work, and I think we've put standards very firmly on the agenda in the borough. But there are some, I think, worrying trends, and I've listed them here, but I'm going to read them out because I too feel actually quite strongly about this. The deteriorating standard of debate and the lack of civility in the behaviour of some members at full council meetings and some community area forums. Now, these are my observations. I've not been reliant on evidence. I've just seen things myself and heard them. And I was minded to recall an old preacher talking about, it was probably 19th century religion, but he said, it's one thing to hate the sin, but not hate the sinner. And I would urge all of us to bear in mind that no matter how strongly we feel somebody is doing something wrong, or they're not doing enough, or they're doing too much, that we must attempt to maintain a civil relationship. Otherwise, it descends into simply the loudest voice is winning, and that isn't the way to make appropriate decisions for our town. There's often aggressive tone. We had a meeting where we discussed what is appropriate language. I'm more worried about attitudes than language, to be frank. The language simply illustrates the way people are behaving and treating others. There are some serious allegations that are being made about a small number of councillors, but nevertheless, it is serious. And we should be seeing more of that later. I'm concerned that the council has limited powers to sanction individuals who breach the Code of Conduct. I was particularly disturbed to see on Look North some time ago a councillor from a not far away council telling me that he'd been admonished by the Standards Committee, but it doesn't matter because what does it matter whether I get told off or not? Well, I think that is I think that is a very, very sad indictment if that's how we're feeling. We are acting on behalf of our community to better our community. And I would like to think that we can work under the Code of Conduct and the Nolan principles to maintain a high standard of debate, out of which we get better decisions made. So there's the end of the sermon. Any questions or comments on my report?
Yes, Chair. I'd just like to overall thank you for for your overall input, for your detailed report, and for your continued impartiality. I think you're a real bonus to the Standards Committee and how it's developing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's kind. Thank you. I'll pay you all off later for saying those nice things. Thank you. So moving on. The Ombudsman's report. Is that you, Jill?
Chair, it's me, Nicola.
Oh, Nicola, hello.
Hello. I'll just share my screen, and that'll give
Yes,
you access
thank you.
to the. Hopefully, that one. Now, can you start to see their PowerPoint presentation,
We
everyone?
can, yes.
If that's working, that's good. Okay, that's the start button, and hopefully we're getting somewhere. Okay, thank you, Chair. This report looks at our complaints that have been received.
Sorry, I just realised, Nicola, I interrupt you, but just to clarify, I said, Nicola, we would deal with the Ombudsman's complaints, but in fact, you're starting with the update on the corporate complaints.
That's correct. Is that okay, Chair?
Yeah, sure, by all means.
Thank you. Okay, so this is looking at quarter, it goes up and including to quarter one this year. And we're just going to have a look at the corporate complaints to start off with. I'll bring you into the Ombudsman complaints shortly after that. So this sets the scene a little bit as well. So just looking at your complaints, this first slide looks at the amount of complaints we've received throughout quite a few years then. You can see there's a couple of peaks. The highest peak being 2017-18 and dropping off, as you see, down to our latest position of 2021. Now, the 2021 data we've extrapolated. So basically, we've taken the quarter one and we projected forward to say if we continued with the amount that we've received at quarter one, this is where we think we would be at the end of the financial year. I do have to caveat that because we've obviously had the situation we've had with COVID largely throughout the first quarter of the year. It probably does impact on those figures. So I would expect we'd see some changes. I would expect that figure to be higher by the end of the year. However, we've used that formula, if you like, to do that. Looking at the trends, so this next slide just draws your attention to the sort of trends we see throughout the year. And we see in quarter one that the amount of complaints starts to pick up with a peak at quarter two and then drops off again at 3 and 4. Largely speaking, this has done a similar sort of picture over the course of the year. The red line basically works out an average. So that's your average amount of complaints, again, quarter by quarter. And you can see that's what we expect it to perform as. In quarter one, it has dropped off. So we're looking at about 332 complaints in quarter one. So we've got a slight drop in the numbers there. And there's probably a mixture of reasons for this. And I believe most of them will be related to COVID-19. We'll come on to them. The slides towards the end of the presentation, look at it in a bit more detail, but we have recategorized some complaints that we may have had, particularly in relation to service changes as a result of COVID-19, and that has impacted on the number of complaints that we've received in that quarter. The next slide looks at the outcomes of those complaints, and I think this is really quite an important area. So whilst we were having a look at the number of complaints received, it's what actually we've done with them that's important. So if we look at this, we can see that in 2019-20, for example, we've had 65% of complaints have either been upheld or partially upheld. So we're saying there's something that wasn't right with how we've handled whatever that was. We've seen a little drop at quarter one. So we've seen 38% of complaints have either been upheld or partially upheld. We have to probably take that into account and read it in context with the fact that 11% at the time this data was drawn hadn't been concluded yet, so they may increase those figures as well. And some were actually discontinued for various reasons. Some where they'd come in and it looked like they'd been recorded initially as a complaint, but actually weren't in fact a complaint. So some recording issues as well there. But the idea is that, you know, it's quite important to look at your upheld and partially upheld complaints and see what they are doing, and they give a bit of a flavour as to how the services are performing in the council. So we've seen a peak at 1920, and at the moment a drop at Q1. If we look at complaints by service area, we've done a similar sort of picture here as well. We can see that the number of the largest volume of complaints we've had actually still is in our waste services areas, and that represents 41% of those that have come in. And it gives you a bit of an idea of complaints received. The chart at the top there looks at the number partially upheld and upheld, and we can see there that business and resources have a higher proportion of those upheld, but then if you actually read that in context with, they've had a smaller number of complaints, so that has to be taken into account as well. Likewise, regeneration and environment, 38% have been either upheld or partially upheld, and 5 complaints received by that area there. The complaints that we record here do not include notifications from missed bins, so they're excluded. And as I said in the earlier slide, we have seen a drop of partially upheld so far this quarter. There's a couple of slides here just on service trends in the different areas, and these show some of the areas that we generally tend to have complaints, particularly bins, waste and recycling, which we get a lot of, and what they're doing. And we can see that there's a couple of peaks there. 1920 and from 1718 that's dropped down. On average, we're still seeing a very, very slightly reducing line there. Bulky waste complaints are decreasing on average, as well as having a slight peak 1819, and grubs and shrubs and green spaces on the whole are going down as well. Children, adults and health, they're also the similar picture there with some service trends. Have a look at adult social care services are dropping on the whole, with children's social care complaints having seen a peak there at 1920, and then learning and early help, a similar sort of picture across there as well. Business and resources, we're looking at cultural operations and events and libraries, with a bit of a contrasting picture on both sides of those there, with a drop from 1920 for cultural operations and events, with libraries having a bit of an increase in complaint levels there. Remember, these are the number of complaints, these aren't looking at how many have been upheld or partially upheld in this respect. Escalation, this is where obviously complaints, where are they being dealt with? In 1920, we can see, which is a similar picture in Q1 of this year as well, that most complaints are dealt with at stage 1. And we can see the escalations for 1920, that we had a number of complaints with 9 within that year going to the Ombudsman and being escalated there. At Q1, we didn't have any Ombudsman escalations there, and the majority continued to be dealt with at stage 1 as well in that respect. Statutory complaints, there weren't any in the children and family social care at Q1. We've had an increase of 33% in adult social care. That is only 2 complaints extra from the previous point of the year, and they have a look at certain areas with integrated community teams, home care, commission service, residential care. They're the areas that have been impacted by those complaints. It's probably worthy of note as well that they're not just council services that we receive complaints for. We also receive complaints for commission services as well with adult social care, in terms of the statutory complaints that we investigate. The majority of those complaints relate to quality of service or delays in providing a service as well. So Ombudsman complaints. In 2019-20, we received 23 decisions. Some of you may know that in the escalation slide, I mentioned 9 that had escalated to the Ombudsman. What we tend to find is that we will receive decisions within the 1920 financial year that actually were started, the complaints process was started prior to that, which is why we see a slight difference when we look at the figures, depending on what we're looking at. So we're looking here at decisions that have come in 1920 from the Ombudsman. So we had 23 decisions, 12 were closed after initial inquiries and weren't investigated, 5 were not upheld, and 6 were upheld. Of all the recommendations we received by the Ombudsman, we've been compliant on every single one of those and within date. It's all been actioned. This next slide just gives you a little flavour as to those upheld complaints I've just mentioned, which services they relate to. So we've had 2 in the children's service. They were both statutory complaints, 2 within education and children's services, 1 in relation to the housing allocations policy, and 1 in relation to environmental health service and public protection regulation. And this particular one was, the fault was found with the handling of the initial complaint as opposed to the formal complaint in relation to that particular one. There have been no escalations to the Ombudsman in Q1 of this year. And if we look at the housing Ombudsman, we've had 4 decisions received from the Housing Ombudsman in 1920. 3 of those weren't upheld and 1 which was upheld, and it was in relation to the actual complaint handling process at that point. Again, we haven't had any complaint escalations in Q1 of this year. So in terms of what we've seen with COVID-19, we've seen the LGSEO, so Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, they suspended their service during lockdown. So they have now since resumed. Service went back to normal on the 29th of June, but they didn't receive any new complaints. They've put them on hold during that period. We had similarly made some small changes to our complaints handling process, and that was in some parts complaints that relate to a change in service as a result of the lockdown were recorded as a council policy issue as opposed to a complaint. And also those people who had complaints already in the system, letters were sent out to those customers to advise them that there may be a delay in responding during that period. The Housing Ombudsman themselves didn't actually make any complaints to their services, so theirs was business as usual. And that, Chair, concludes the information contained within there. If there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Colleagues, could I ask you if you've got questions of Nicola of a technical nature in relation to her presentation? Could we deal with those first? And then if you've got questions about the impact of some of the data that you're seeing there, or about the way in which it's being reported, or any issues, could we deal with them separately? So first of all, any questions of a technical nature regarding Nicola's very thorough presentation, for which we thank you very much, Nicola.
Yeah, thank you.
No questions?
Nope.
Okay, any comments about the data that we're seeing, the trends that we're looking at? No. One thing that we had a presentation from at one of our previous meetings, and the issue of bins seems to come up in an enormous amount of times, and we see it skewing a lot of data. Now, from a commenting on data, it's fine to say, well, the source is a lot of complaints about bins, but is anybody asking the question, why do we have so many complaints about bins, and what steps are we taking to remedy whatever it is that seems to prompt so many complaints about bins?
Chair, I'm not too sure whether the service itself has had a more thorough look into that. They do receive copies of the complaints that come through, and in there's probably quite a lot of detail as well, so they could well be doing their own investigations into that. I haven't had anything specific in relation to this presentation for you.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicola. No? Well, maybe it's something that you would like to think about and take up in another forum. Okay, thank you very much. So I think that, we now have item 8, which is the Regulations of Investigatory Powers Act. Jill Hayton, I think, is speaking to this.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, this is the regular report that comes to committee about the Council's use of the investigatory powers. You can see in the report that over the last 3 months, the Council hasn't authorised the use of any covert surveillance powers, any covert human intelligence powers, nor has it used any powers to acquire any communications data. The report sets out a letter that we've received quite recently from the IPCO, which is the regulatory body that oversees the use of the powers across local authorities, across all public bodies. The letter sets out the findings of the IPCO's review about how data that public authorities gain through surveillance and it is handled by those public authorities. I'd like members to note that this hasn't come about by any actions of this particular council, but it's more about the failings in the UK intelligence community. The IPCO's review found that many public authorities were retaining data for longer than is necessary or appropriate because in many circumstances the public authority hadn't really implemented proper data retention and disposal policies, and because public authorities have a tendency to operate within a culture of comprehensive retention to prevent operational data loss in the future. The IPCO found that the systems used to transfer and securely store data may not promote or enable appropriate disposal and destruction processes within public authorities. And this is an issue for all public authorities, not just because of their requirement to comply with the requirements of RIPA, but also in terms of their requirements to comply with general data protection legislation around handling and retention of data that is no longer needed for the purpose for which it was acquired, i.e. the investigation or the allegation of some wrongdoing. The IPCO has set out in their letter a number of recommended steps that they're looking to see all public authorities take to address the issue. Normally in the September meeting of Standards Committee, we will bring forward a review of the Council's policies and guidance on this. Because of the late receipt of the letter from the IPCO, we felt it was better for officers to take a more holistic look at our data retention and handling for RIPA and make sure that our policy review and our guidance review reflects those amendments that the IPCO wants us to take. It's my proposal, Chair, to bring back to committee, hopefully in December, the review of the policy and the outcome of the review of our handling of data for investigatory work. That's the sum of the report, if any members have any questions.
Thank you, Jill. Any questions? I have to admit, every time this comes up on the agenda, I hope we're going to see something about Secret Service activity. But
the link about the IPCO's investigation into the intelligence services within the UK is quite an interesting one. It is quite brief, but it does kind of give a flavour of how it does work in investigations in intelligence services.
Thank you. But being serious for a minute, you can assure us that South Tyneside Council is either compliant or in the process of becoming compliant with GDPR and other matters.
Yes, Chair, we do have in our current guidance document clear guidance. It has guidance around the retention of information and data that's recovered as part of surveillance activity that the council undertakes under these powers. Now, the council does have its own retention and destruction guidelines for data protection anyway, and these two documents do need to dovetail with each other. Now, the retention of information that's obtained in investigations for purpose of criminal proceedings is subject to specific legal requirements around their retention. And what I want to do, Chair, is make sure that not only have we got that guidance in our guidance to officers, but we're actually putting that into practice as well within the services. What we do in South Tyneside is each service is responsible for their own retention guidelines documents. So they're responsible for making sure that they retain the information for the relevant amount of time, but that it is not longer than is necessary, both in terms of their operational need, but in terms of data protection requirements as well. And then they're also responsible for making sure that they securely destroy that data when it is no longer necessary to keep it. And it's that whole process that needs to be considered and looked at, and make sure that we are doing that and that we are destroying data when we do no longer have any need to keep it.
Thank you very much. Any other questions of Jill on that matter? No, in which case we've reached the end of the agenda. I don't think we have any other business. So can I thank you all for your participation and attendance, members, officers and viewers. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.